Every year at Christmas, we've made a tabletop game for our nieces and nephews, and every year, it's gotten bigger and bigger. But this year, we're doing something different. Instead of making a bigger game, we want to make a better game. We're focusing on better gameplay, technical innovations with the electronics and interface, a better board design, cooler player tokens, and exciting, fast-paced gameplay. And since this is for Christmas, it's going to have lots of snow. The one main thing we want out of this game is that the kids have a great time playing it. But that's easier said than done. This game board may look simple, but like everyone's favorite transforming robots, it's more than meets the eye. Let's get into it.
You've heard the phrase, let's take it back to the drawing board. Well, for this game, that's what we did. We felt that some of our last games were too long and tough to play for some of the younger kids. So this year, the goal was simple. Make a game that is fun to play on a whiteboard alone, without any of the bells and whistles, and then add the bells and whistles. We used the whiteboard to draw out the basic concepts. It's a circular game board with pads that go from the home bases to the pads in the center. The goal is for the players to get their tokens to the center pads and stay there for as long as possible.
The original board was going to be 8 winding pathways that made their way to 4 center pads. Each team was going to have 4 players. We came up with this idea the day after Christmas last year, just after having played the last game, which was a massive RPG-style tabletop game. So by the time we started making this game, we had plenty of notes from months of talking about it. We got some blank dry erase cards and made power-ups players would use to take to the center. Then, we played a test game. But as often happens, the notes and theories did not totally translate into reality. Not yet, at least. The game was still too slow, and it was really tough to get even 1 player to the center, never mind 4. So we erased everything and started again. We decided to have 2 paths of 4 steps, not 8. We rebalanced the deck to have more power-up cards and less defensive cards to help players move their tokens to the center. Then, we played again.
It was better, but unfortunately, still too slow. At this rate, the kids would be grown-ups by the time they got their players to the center. We were worried that a card shuffler was going to be more interesting, and to be fair, it's pretty satisfying. We took out one of the center pads and removed a player for each team, making it 3.
We removed even more of the defensive cards to give the game some real forward momentum, and it worked. For the first time, the game was fast and fun. We finally had an analog version of the game planned and balanced. But this is Christmas, and our nieces and nephews weren't going to be impressed with a basic board game. It was time to add some technology.
We got some radio frequency identification tags, aka RFID tags, and some readers so that we could use a Raspberry Pi as a controller to keep track of which team is in the center throughout the game. And this meant programming and soldering.
We soldered some pins to the RFID modules so that they could be plugged into the breadboard and then connected to the Raspberry Pi. But we had never used these readers before, so we had to map out all of the pins and wires. The biggest challenge was to get the 3 readers to work at once without interfering with one another. After some trial and error and a bunch of research, we got it to work, and we were able to create the permanent circuit on the breadboard.
We used a strict wire color code to properly control the inputs and outputs. Last year, we exploded our Raspberry Pi, so it's always scary to connect a new circuit. The controller was configured as a web server, and we could access the game via web browsers on any device. The brain of the game was ready, and we could push on with our prototype interface. And now we could keep track of which team had their tokens in the center of the game longest.
But this was only the beginning. It was time to get off the computer and onto the crafting table. Before chopping up brand new materials, we made a temporary version of the board to test the dimensions and how they affected the gameplay. We grabbed some scrap pieces of XPS foam and glued a base together. Then we cut up a piece of coroplast and used a lid to cut a hole out of the center for the electronics. And we glued all of that together with hot glue.
To make the centerpiece, we measured the distance between the RFID readers to avoid interference, and we used polymer clay to make some square landing pads. These didn't look much like the final board, but it would let us test if the readers were going to work through plastic. We really need a 3D printer, because the polymer clay work on this game was murder. But you'll see that later. Once the landing pads were done, we made a centerpiece to hold the pads and allow the wiring to drop down below the board. This would hide all the electronics so it looked like one smooth piece. We used more foam, coroplast, and hot glue for this.
Once our 3 RFID reader boxes were done, we used wooden dowels as legs to elevate the center piece so it would be even with the rest of the board. Before going any further, we wired the whole thing up and tested it by placing the RFID tags on the readers. And holy crap, it worked. The 3 sensors were faithfully reading tags for each team. And to be able to play the game, we used Sharpie markers to draw the game board onto the Coroplast. Since the game was going to be really fast-paced, we decided on striking primary colors for the pathways to make it clear whose team was who once things got hectic.
Once that was all put together, we tagged some temporary minis. The bases were a little too small for the tags, so we punched out some circles from foam sheets and stuck them to the bottom with double-sided tape. This way, we could stick the tags to the minis. With that done, we assembled the mock-up and tested the tagged characters by placing them on the central modules. And now, it was time to play.
Up until this point, we had only played the analog version of the game, so we weren't sure how the game would feel with a full interface. And I have to say, it was such a relief when we found ourselves wanting to play more rounds of the game. We could only hope that the kids would feel the same. And it was time to take things to the next level. We needed a real test with real people. So, we ditched our dry erase cards and made some permanent ones with Sharpie markers, and we primed and painted our temporary minis with some contrast paint. Then we took the whole thing on the road and brought it to a professional game testing facility. Meaning we drove it to Grandma's house and we roped our grandparents into testing our game with us. It didn't take them long to learn the game, and we played a whole bunch of rounds without a hitch. Congrats to JC and the Penguins team for winning the very first Snow Jumpers tournament.
But that was only the beginning. We still had to figure out the ergonomics of the gameplay with the iPad interface. Since the board was round, we decided that a round table would be the best. Luckily, we have a 48-inch trampoline that is basically the same size as most folding round tables sold on Amazon. We used it to get an idea of how players would be seated and how the iPad interface would be used.
Okay, the game was finally done. Oh wait, no, the game was not even built at all. This was just a test. So, we went to Home Depot and got the real materials to finally start building the real game. We grabbed some 1-inch XPS foam and chopped it in the parking lot so that it would fit in the car, and we also needed some 2-inch foam, but we already had a ton of that left over from last year's game.
Since we had so many circles to cut, we bought a hot wire cutting table with a jig that allows you to spin your pieces. Cutting circles with a utility knife is just horrible. We still have PTSD from the previous year, and we really wanted to cut clean professional pieces. We assembled the thing and got down to business. And by down to business, we mean cut 1,000,000 small circles and then a few really oversized circles. The small circles were for the outside home bases, and the large circles would be the game board. We also cut some hoops to make a hollow stand for the game that would hide the computer and wires. We cut 4 little arches in the bottom ring for airflow to keep the computer cool and to allow the power cord to come out.
We cut the home base pieces and fit them to the main base, and then cut all the pieces for the central module, including some stands for the RFID readers. We used Gorilla Glue to stick the whole thing together, as well as some hot glue to hold the pieces in place while the Gorilla Glue cured. We made the centerpiece completely out of foam. We measured everything because it was important that the pads for the RFID readers were the proper distance apart so that they would not interfere with one another. Then we glued the small home base pieces together and stuck them to the game base. We measured equal distances on the outside of the ring using some basic geometry principles and then used bamboo skewers to fix the smaller circles to the main board. We now had the top of the board and its base completed, and they actually fit together. This was a big improvement from our previous year's game.
But yet again, that was just the beginning. We needed to turn the pink foam into a snowy Christmas arena. So we mixed up some plaster of Paris and filled in the cracks to unify the small circular pieces and the main body of the game. This hides all the gaps and lines and makes it look like one piece. The concept we were going for was something resembling a stadium. Snow Jumpers is the national sport of Blizzard's Ends, the universe that all our Christmas games take place in. So a stadium seemed right. Once it was dry, we went outside and sanded the plaster of Paris to avoid making a bunch of dust in the house. We then sealed it with Mod Podge. Well, we tried to. But the Mod Podge jug was glued shut. So we pulled out a monkey wrench and eventually got the bottle to open. We sealed the entire outside of the game just to keep the foam from chipping and cracking. Then we primed the entire thing white.
Once the primer was dry, it was finally painting time. We painted the rim with gold metallic paint, and the color scheme was going to be 100% Christmas with white, red, green, and gold, so it made sense to have the base be a candy cane pattern. But that is easier said than done. It actually requires a bit of math to make sure the lines you draw on a curve are even. So we mapped it out on pieces of paper that could curve and started painting lines. Then we used some painter's tape to make sure the lines were even. But unfortunately, this didn't work out that well. It was extremely long and the pattern was tough to follow. So we decided to paint the lines by hand and then use painter's tape and clean the edges with white paint. This was much faster and a cleaner result. We repeated this process all around the base of the game. It was long, but it was worth it. Once that was done, we painted the arches in the base with the team colors of our players, like the way a sports team would have its colors in their home stadium.
With the paint job completed, it was time to make the stepping stones for the pathways to the center, which meant pulling out the polymer clay. We planned to use Sculptamold for the snowy top of the board, but we needed a way to put evenly spaced tiles in it before it hardened. So, we made a bunch of placeholder tiles, the same size as what our colored pieces would be, and made a stamping jig. We used wood blocks, tongue depressors, and popsicle sticks for the frame, and now we could stamp the correct shape and spacing for our stepping stones.
But before we made our finished tiles, we needed to do some tests. We wanted the tiles to look sparkly and icy, so we tried brushing some mica powder onto the white polymer clay tiles, and we brushed some glaze onto one half of each tile to test how that would look. We made a circular one that was a gradient of various blues, and they came out looking okay, but we weren't really sure if this was going to tie in well with the rest of the board, so we decided not to use the mica powder and just use colored polymer clay. We also thought the glaze looked a little more like jewelry, so we didn't end up using that either.
We put the clay flattening pasta machine to work making green, blue, red, and yellow tiles, all of the colors of our snow jumper teams. We used square cookie cutters to stamp out 8 squares of each color. And once we finally figured out the look we wanted for the tiles, we used dried pastel powder to weather them with darker colors. Because our game has characters that fly with jetpacks, we used the shading to simulate rocket burns on the tile. We repeated the process for each color and team, and quick tip, do red last as it leaves red dye everywhere.
We did the same thing on the large discs of polymer clay that would serve as the home bases. We used wood block letters to stamp the team names into the discs and sculpting tools to draw the designs. It was like sculpting big coins. Silicone tools are super helpful to smooth out imperfections. The blue team are Yetis, the green team are reindeer, the red team are snowmen, and the gold team are penguins. But we'll talk more about them later when we paint the game tokens, which are really cool by the way. Once we had all of our pieces for the top of the board ready, we made some candy cane arches to decorate the arching doorways at the base of the game, using a broken clay extruder to make long ropes of white, green, and red clay. But the first attempt was a failure because the red clay was way too hard and it cracked and broke. Luckily, we had some clay softener that helped to moisten the red clay, and we were able to redo and twist up our candy canes. We used a template to make sure that they were the right size and then bent them into an arch shape. We made some flags with the 4 team colors and team initials stamped into them and used clay adhesive to stick them to the sides of the arches. We used metal straws to bend the flags to make them look like they were waving in the wind, then cooked them.
Now it was time for the tough stuff, the centerpieces. We made a gem template that a flattened piece of clay could be molded around using 2 cookie cutters and some clay. Then we covered them with tin foil so that the clay wouldn't stick to the template. Our plan was to use purple clay as it was a different color than the 4 primary team colors on the board. But this backfired because it looked like an old rotting toy from the 1980s. So we switched gears and used baby blue. We actually had to order the last of it from a store about an hour drive away from us. But it was lucky that they had a few. We picked it up and got to work. We used an updated version of the template with more white clay at an angle to make a better shape. And that was a pretty good idea, except that we forgot the tin foil, which is pretty important. So they fused with the white clay while baking and ripped to pieces when we tried to take them off. We had to make them twice. Still, right now they look great, before the disaster. We used similar tactics as the other pieces on the board and brushed some dry pastel on the baby blue gems.
We were not quite done with the polymer clay yet. We wanted the top of the game to be covered in snow with the footprints of the 4 teams making a trail towards the center. so we drew footprints to scale for the 4 teams and shaped some polymer clay following the guides. FYI, snowman footprints are just a circle. Then we took a nail and some clay adhesive to give the footprint a handle that we could use to stamp footprints into some wet Sculptamold, but we couldn't just hope that they would work on our finished board. So we did what we did with everything else, a bunch of tests to see how the footprints would come out. We tried various colors on the base of the footprint and used AK interactive ice sparkles to simulate the difference between compressed snow and fluffy snow. We also took the opportunity to test our stamp, which worked pretty well, but we found it worked better if you add a little water to the bottom so it doesn't stick to the Sculptamold. It took about 4 tests to find the right pressure and colors to use for the footprints, but as it was the only decoration the board was going to have, it was really important that we got it right.
Now that the tests were done, it was crunch time. We'd put it off for long enough. It was time to make the actual final board. So we mixed up some Sculptamold, teaming up for the job, and poured it out in small batches. This way, we would have time to stamp our path into it before it dried. This was a tense moment, because if we messed up, weeks of work would be lost. The stamp worked, but we still had to widen the print so that the tiles would fit as the Sculptamold dried.
We used white test tiles to check that our real tiles would fit, and some small stampers we made out of white tiles and small wooden blocks to widen the spaces. It was tense work, but it got done without any hiccups. We repeated the process 4 times, once to make a track for every team. We got a little better at it each time, but it was still a little nerve-wracking because it was such an important part of the board, and we only had one chance to get it right. So we moved on to the inner spaces where there would be snow and footprints.
We used a metal wire to map out a path to guide our footprints. Then we used our stamps to put a print on either side of the wire. This worked perfectly. We did them one at a time until we had all 4 areas done.
There was a specific technique for each footprint we put in the board. The penguins were pretty simple, as it was flat on the bottom, but the reindeer print is a very specific shape that can pick up a lot of Sculptamold in the crevices if you don't wet it well enough or if you press it too deeply. The Yeti prints were special because they had left and right feet, and we needed to be careful not to mix them up. We also had to press the toes in first to make sure they had a solid impression. The snowmen were probably the easiest because they were just circles. Then we added some Sculptamold to the home base platforms and stamped a big circle into them. That seemed to work, so we moved on to the centerpiece. Since our middle platforms were removable, we needed to have them in place when we added Sculptamold to the center. To make sure they didn't stick, we wrapped them in cellophane. Then, we carefully added Sculptamold to match the height of the rest of the board.
Once everything was dry, we were ready to add the tiles. But even though we had tried to make the spaces wider than the tiles, many of them were still smaller after drying. We had to widen them with silicone tools and X-Acto knives, all the while making sure not to ruin everything we did.
Next, we painted the insides of the footprints. Even though we tried many shades of blue, we went with a much more realistic style and just used white paint with a pale blue in the areas where the foot would have compacted the ground more, and this looked way better. So far, everything was going well, but we had just reached another make it or break it point. We were going to use a product we had never used before, Flex Paste.
We had seen a Woodland Scenics video where this got a very realistic snow effect that stayed white. Last year, we had some snow in our dioramas and it turned yellow on us. So we were hoping this wouldn't happen. The Flex Paste was pretty easy to use. We applied it with a brush, then dappled it with a sponge to give it a more realistic texture.
Once the Flex Paste was on, it was time to add these AK interactive ice sparkles to the bottom of the footprints. AK Interactive actually sent us this, so thanks so much, AK. The ice sparkles are extremely fine, so we used a scoop to pour them into each footprint, spreading them evenly. After doing our tests, we were becoming masters at it. We glued them down with some diluted white glue. You can see how the sparkles make the darker compacted snow look. We were really happy with how these footprints turned out.
Once we had the prints made, it was time to add some snow flocking. We thought about various techniques for sprinkling it on, but in the end, we just used our hands so that we could try to avoid getting any in the footprints or tile spaces. And when we were happy with that, we used scenic cement to lock the snow in place. But of course, flocking is unruly and we still had to clean out every one of the tile spaces. Once everything had dried, we went back to the spaces and cut out any snow that was left and used our flocking vacuum to pick up the mess.
Now was the moment of truth. Would our tiles finally fit into the spaces? The answer was yes. All of the tiles and home plate discs fit. What a major relief. Now we could set them in place permanently. But the top of the board was not quite finished. The landing platforms in the center needed special wiring to sit in place properly. So we pulled out the soldering pen and installed L-shaped connectors to the wires to be able to send them straight down instead of sideways.
And once that was done, we made a new platform for the centerpiece, very similar to the one we had made earlier for the test version, except that this one had a tray made of XPS foam to hold the breadboard and Raspberry Pi in place under the board for an easy game setup. Last year's game took 2 hours to wire and it needed to be wired each time we wanted to play. This year, it would literally be plug and play. We measured it up and hoped that it would be the right height. We put it in the center of the base and put the board over it. And luckily, it was exactly right, after a bunch of tries and adjustments. The center was almost ready, but we found that even though we had spaced the RFID readers further apart, we were still getting interference. So, to fix this, we added some copper foil tape and grounding wire inside the edges of the landing pads, and that luckily solved the problem. We also had to move the breadboard from under the sensors. It was too noisy to have it there, unfortunately, so that's why it's placed beside it. Not as neat, but at least it works.
With the electronics running like a dream, it was time to set the tiles in permanently. We sanded back the sides of each tile and then used a 2-part epoxy as the gluing agent. We chose this route because the tiles were going to be used fairly roughly, and we didn't want any of them coming loose during the game. The epoxy dried pretty quickly, so we could only do a few at a time, but we stayed patient and we set them in without any trouble. We did the same thing for the home plate discs. Once set, the tiles were rock solid. They were not going anywhere anytime soon. But that wasn't the end of gluing things together. We still had the candy cane arches and the entire top of the board to glue to the base. We just used hot glue for the candy canes because it was easier and they aren't an integral part of the game. But for the top of the board, we used Gorilla Glue as the main adhesive. We spread the glue around with some stir sticks. Then we glued the top of the board to the base. But that was a mistake, because we didn't align the color paths to their corresponding color arches. But we noticed quickly enough that we could pull the top off and fix it, but man, it was a scare. That's the thing about doing work after midnight. The best practice is to not do that. But we did, and we messed up. But we sorted it out, and once we had it glued down, we put some wood planks with weights on them to help the pieces stay tight together.
The board was nearly done, but it was definitely not the end. What good is a board that has no player tokens? Last year we had designed some minis for our game, and although they looked really cool, they came out a little messed up. We designed them too small and everything was too thin. And the resin was too brittle. There were holes in the cloth and the ankles would snap in a strong wind. This year we wanted to do a lot better and have some really fun designs that departed from anything we've done before. So, we came up with some chunky designs that would be tough and ready for contact sport.
As we mentioned, the game has 4 teams. The Yetis, the Snowmen, the Penguins, and the Reindeer. We gave them all personalities and posed them in various action stances that really helped us show what kind of team they were. We had them sent out to be printed in tough resin, and we hoped that that would be a lot more durable. We started with just one reindeer since the antlers would be the weakest part of any of the models. We threw it around a lot and even played a few test games with it. It seemed to be working fine, so we primed it and painted it. The reindeer are the green team, so we used all kinds of cool green colors. Big up the RD. For the fur, we used a few shades of brown, a dark base, a light undercoat, and a rust-colored top coat. And for the boots and gloves, we used 3 or 4 different shades of green, and even some yellow, to create the effect of shine and shadow. Once the rest of the minis were printed, we painted them in their team colors. Mini painting is fun, but still, painting 12 minis does take time and is a little tough on the neck.
Still, the work paid off because these minis were really cool and the paint jobs were not half bad. We used every techniques we've been learning over the past few months and did our best. But here's the thing, right after we finished painting these minis, 2 of them fell and snapped. This was devastating as we were running out of time and we were now worried that these minis could not be used in the game. Our resin printer was awesome and replaced these minis last second, but we were still worried they might break and the kids would not be able to play with them. And also, we spent so many hours carefully painting them, we wanted to keep them intact. So we called an industrial pieces manufacturing 3D printer who worked in plastic and got a whole new batch made. The plastic batch could not be quite as detailed as the resin ones and would have some layering lines, but they would be a lot tougher. The only thing was, we now had just a few days left to finish, and a full paint job would not have really worked well on these minis because of the layering. So we came up with an idea. We would make a monochromatic team color version that could be painted with contrast paint.
We primed them all using Mechanis Gray and white zenithal priming. It got to work. In order to keep them from being completely monotone, we still painted the snow and their eyes. The eyes with pupils really made the characters look striking. Once we had them painted, we tagged them with RFID tags, and we tested them to see if the readers in the centerpieces were picking them up properly. And they were. These minis were ready to get in the game. In between all these crafting tasks, we worked on our game cards as they needed to be printed. So we made some designs and sent them out. But that's not all we did. We also had an analog version of the board made just in case everything we'd built suddenly burst into flames. The game came complete with the cards, game tokens with stickers of all of the teams, a rulebook, and a foldable game board. The only thing we had to do was peel the stickers off their backing and stick them to the plastic tokens. It may not be as grand as the handcrafted version, but it'll get you through the holidays.
But we couldn't make the children play our game without some kind of incentive. So we got a whole bunch of chocolates and gifts and filled some stocking to give to the winners after the game. But that's not all. We also got some medals printed with the Blizzard's and Snowjumper logo on them to have a podium ceremony just like the Olympics.
After an intense few months, we had reached the end of the crafting, programming, wiring, painting, metal making, and gift wrapping. It was actually time to surprise the kids and play the game. But would they like it? It was smaller than last year and more simple, so we really hoped that the gameplay would be engrossing enough to give them a good time. Well, we'd find out soon enough because it was Christmas, so we packed everything into the car and took it to our sister's house where we were having Christmas dinner, and also where this cat scratched us. We set up the game and waited for the kids to arrive. We had set out to make a game that was easy to play, fast-paced, minimal, and most of all, fun. So, we unveiled the game and let the kids attack it. They picked it up really fast, which was great. And this was a chance to find out how tough the plastic minis were. They got knocked around over and over. One even fell on the floor, but they came out unscathed. They were a huge success.
And the parents enjoyed cheering for their favorite teams using the spectator app that we had made to accompany the board game. It was an extremely close game, but the reindeer managed to eke a last-second victory over the Yetis. The Yetis are definitely the team to watch out for next year. We gave out the medals and the stockings to all the kids, and with that the game was over. Or was it? Some of the kids asked to play another round of the game after the tournament was done. We were so happy that they had a good enough time to want to keep playing.
Watching our nieces and nephews enjoy playing was truly the best thing about making this game. Because isn't that what games are for? Take away the planning, testing, programming, and crafting, and what you're left with is how much fun you're having. In the end, games are meant to do one thing, and that's create happiness. And I think we did that this year. But I'll stop talking and let you enjoy the final results of everything we built. I personally think the Penguin Minis are totally awesome, but you can judge for yourself. Thanks so much to our family for indulging in our madness, and thanks so much to all of you for watching. If you'd like to see more of what we do, consider subscribing and following us on social media. And of course, happy holidays.